Gwyn Brown reached the top of the mountain at 7:30, and the ground his crane stood on had dropped 10 feet in the night. It was Friday, the 21st of October, 1966. Cold, wet, mist so thick he could barely see the far end of the tip. Brown was a crane driver for the National Coal Board, and this black hill of colliery waste above the Welsh village of Aberfan was his workplace. He had left it the evening before, solid enough to park machinery on. Now the rails were bent and hanging out over a hole. Tipping gangs stood at the edge and looked down into it. Nobody had ever seen the tip do that before. They tried to drag the crane back from the drop and wait for the charge hand. What none of them could do was pick up a telephone. There was a line on that mountain, strung up for exactly this kind of morning. The cable had been stolen, so a man was sent down on foot instead. Half a mile below, at the bottom of the slope, the village was already awake. Children were walking to school in the mist, coats buttoned, satchels swinging, because it was the last morning before half-term. They had until noon. Aberfan sat in a narrow valley 4 miles south of Merthyr Vale in Glamorgan, South Wales. One road in, one road out. The river, a railway, and rows of terraced houses climbing the slope. Everything in it existed because of one thing: coal. Merthyr Vale Colliery had sunk its shafts between 1869 and 1875, and the village grew around the pit the way moss grows on a stone. Men went down in the dark and came up black, and what they earned built the chapels and the choirs and the rugby club. But coal does not come out of the ground clean. For every ton of it, the pit brought up rock, shale, and slurry. Waste. And waste has to go somewhere. First, they dumped it on the valley floor. By about 1916, the valley floor was full, so they started hauling it up the flank of Merthyr Mountain and tipping it there, above the rooftops. Over the years, they built 7 tips on that hillside, 7 black pyramids of waste, standing over a village of a couple of thousand people. The children of Aberfan grew up under them, the way other children grow up under a church spire. They played on them, slid down them on trays. Nobody in the village had the power to move them. And by 1966, the coal industry belonged to the government. Halfway up the slope, at the top end of the village, stood Pantglas Junior School. Long stone building with tall windows, an asphalt yard, and about 240 children on the register. Behind it, a low bank, a lane, then open hillside going straight up into cloud. The headmistress was Anne Jennings. Her deputy, David Baynon, had been in the job about 6 weeks. He was a Merthyr man himself, 47 years old, teaching the top class of 34. Here is the part of this story that is hardest to sit with. The danger was not a secret. It was not a theory. It had been put in writing, on official paper, 3 years before anything happened. Between July 1963 and March 1964, letters went back and forth between Merthyr Vale Borough Council and the National Coal Board. Somebody had to give those letters a heading, so they typed one across the top of the page. Danger from coal slurry being tipped at the rear of the Pantglas schools. That heading was written 3 years and 3 months before the 21st of October. The man who started the correspondence was Dai Jones, the borough and waterworks engineer. On the 24th of July, 1963, he set the problem out in one sentence that reads now like a prophecy. The slurry, he wrote, was so fluid and the gradient so steep that it could not possibly stay in position in the wintertime or during periods of heavy rain. Not might not, could not possibly. He was an engineer, describing a physical certainty. The reply did not stop the tipping. 1964, a local councillor, Gwyn Williams, said out loud in a council meeting what everybody below that hill was already thinking. If the tip ever moved suddenly, she warned, it could threaten the whole school. She was, unfortunately, exactly right. The school had already complained about something else. Water. Black water ran off the tips and down through the village whenever it rained, and it got into the school. The parents got up a petition about it. Anne Jennings passed that petition to the council the year before the disaster. So by 1966, there was a paper trail. An engineer, a counselor, a headmistress, petition of parents. All of it filed. The tipping carried on. The tip that would decide all of this had a number rather than a name. Tip 7. They started it at Easter 1958, on steeper ground than any of the others, higher up the mountain. by 1966 it stood about 111 feet tall. 34 meters, holding something like 297,000 cubic yards of waste. A hill made by hand, sitting on top of a hill, and underneath it, the thing nobody at the tip wanted to discuss, springs. Water comes out of Merthyr Mountain at that spot. It always had. It was marked on the Ordnance survey maps, going back generations. The men had built a mountain of loose, ground-up rock directly on top of running water. Fine coal waste is not like soil. Get it wet enough, and it stops behaving like a solid at all. Grains lose their grip on one another. The water carries the load, and the whole mass turns into something closer to a liquid. Engineers call what happens next a flowslide. It does not slump and stop the way a normal landslip does. It runs. All that pile needed was rain. 3 weeks before that Friday, about 6.5 inches of rain fell on Merthyr Mountain. Every drop of it went into tip 7. By the night of the 20th of October, the thing above Aberfan was not really a heap of rock anymore. It was a reservoir with a crust on top, which brings us back to Gwyn Brown, standing at the edge of a hole at 7:30 in the morning. The charge hand of the gang, Leslie Davis, was not there when the subsidence was found. He was down at the office, filing his weekly reports. By the time he climbed up and saw it himself, the hole had a depth to it that made no sense. The tip had swallowed its own summit. They agreed the tipping had to stop, and the crane had to come back off the edge. Then they went to send word down, and that is when the stolen cable mattered. There was no phone, so Dai Jones, a slinger, set off down the mountain on foot to tell the colliery office what the tip was doing. A man walking in the mist. In 1966, that was the warning system. While he walked, the school below him started its day. Children came in out of the cold, hung up their coats, and went into morning assembly. They sang. It was the last day of term, so it was a short one. Then they filed back to their classrooms, and the registers came out. In the corridor by the office, a few children queued to hand in their dinner money to the school meals. Clerk Nan C. Williams. She was 44 years old. By 9 o'clock, up on the tip, a second depression had opened. The men stood watching the surface of the waste and could see it changing while they looked at it. At about 9:15, Gwyn Brown saw the section that had sunk begin to rise. That is the detail that stays with you. It did not fall. It came up. He described it afterwards as moving slowly at first, and then at a tremendous speed. Leslie Davis said the mass came down at a hell of a speed, in waves. Roughly 100,000 cubic meters of saturated black slurry tore out of the tip and started down the mountain. How fast it went is still argued about. The careful geotechnical work puts it somewhere between 11 and 21 miles an hour. Walking pace, given the weight of a hillside. Fast enough that nothing in front of it had time to move. It took out the boundary of a farm. It went over 2 farm cottages, crossed a disused canal and a railway embankment, and the embankment barely slowed it. Then it reached the top of the village, where the ground flattens out. It traveled about 500 meters in all. The whole thing was over in a few minutes. And because of the mist, almost nobody in a van saw it coming. They heard it. Survivors describe a sound like thunder that would not stop, or a jet engine, or a train coming through the houses. In the corridor at Pantglas, Nancy Williams heard it and did the only thing there was time to do. She told the children, queuing in front of her, to get down, and she put herself over them. 5 children were underneath her. One of them, Karen Thomas, said years later that Nancy Williams jumped on top of us and took the full impact. Nancy Williams was killed. All 5 of the children she covered lived. In a classroom at the end of the building, David Baynon, 6 weeks into the job, was last seen trying to get his class behind a blackboard. Then the slurry reached the school and the row of houses on Moy Road, and the noise stopped. What followed the noise was silence, and people who lived through it say that was the worst part of all. Then the village ran towards the school. Mothers in aprons, men off nights, anybody with hands. Down at Merthyr Vale Colliery, the miners heard what had happened, came up out of the pit and ran up the hill to dig. They dug with shovels, with coal picks, with their bare hands, in waste that was still soft enough to slide back into everything they cleared. In an hour or two, there were hundreds of people there, then thousands arriving from every valley within reach. Too many, in the end. The police had to ask them to stop coming. because the crowd was making it harder to work. Firemen, ambulance crews, quarrymen, soldiers, long lines of men passing buckets of black waste hand to hand out of the building. At about 11 o'clock that morning, a fireman named Roy Thomas saw something pale in all that dark. It was the hair of an 8-year-old boy called Jeff Edwards. He was blonde, and that is what saved him. The color showed up against the black. They got him out. Jeff Edwards was the last child brought out of Pantglas Junior School alive. The digging went on for days after that. Nobody else came out. The final count was 144 people. 116 of them were children. 109 of those children were inside the junior school, along with 5 of their teachers. 28 adults died. 29 children and 6 adults were injured. In one morning, a village of that size lost most of a generation of one school. The half-term holiday that was due to start at noon began instead in a place that had gone completely quiet. On the 27th of October, 6 days later, they held the funeral. 81 children and 1 woman were buried together in the cemetery above the village, in 2 trenches 80 feet long. Around 10,000 people came. The hillside was covered in wreaths, and behind the mourners, still standing on the mountain, were the other tips. The Queen came on the 29th of October, 8 days after. Prince Philip had come first, and Lord Snowdon, and the Prime Minister, Harold Wilson. Elizabeth II later said that the delay in going to Aberfan was one of her deepest regrets. But what Aberfan wanted was not a visit, it was an answer. On the 26th of October, 5 days after the slide, the Secretary of State for Wales appointed a tribunal of inquiry. It was chaired by Lord Justice Edmund Davies, a Welsh judge born a few miles away who knew exactly what those valleys were. Sitting with him were Harold Harding, a consulting civil engineer, and Vernon Lawrence, the former clerk of Monmouthshire County Council. Tribunal sat for 76 days, the longest inquiry of its kind in Britain up to that point. It heard 136 witnesses, examined 300 exhibits, and recorded about 2.5 million words. Among those exhibits were the letters, the ones with danger from coal slurry typed across the top. Chairman of the National Coal Board was Lord Roe Benz. When the board's position was finally put, it leaned on one claim above all others, that nobody could have known. There was a spring inside that mountain. The springs were on the maps. Local men had known about the water up there all their lives. The tribunal set that evidence aside. The report came out in August 1967, and for an official document, it is startlingly plain-spoken. Blame for the disaster rests upon the National Coal Board. The Aberfan disaster could and should have been prevented. It described what happened as the result of bungling ineptitude by many men charged with tasks for which they were totally unfitted. Not an act of God, not bad luck, not an unforeseeable event, cleared Merthyr Vale Borough Council, and it cleared the National Union of Mine Workers. 9 coal board employees were named as bearing some degree of responsibility. And then nothing happened to any of them. Nobody was prosecuted. Nobody was sacked. Nobody was demoted. Lord Roe Benz offered his resignation, and in September 1967 the government refused it. He stayed on as chairman of the National Coal Board. Then came the part that people in Aberfan will still bring up first. After the disaster, money arrived from all over the world. Aberfan Disaster Fund closed to donations in January 1967, with nearly 90,000 separate contributions. Coins from schoolchildren, checks from strangers, 1,606,929 pounds. The remaining tips were still up on the mountain, and the village wanted them gone. Coal Board and the Treasury would not carry the full cost of taking them away. So the fund was made to pay. 150,000 pounds was taken out of money donated for the bereaved and spent clearing away the waste that had caused the bereavement. George Thomas, the Secretary of State for Wales, had objections at first, and then went along with it, and pressed the fund to agree. It was not paid back for 30 years. In 1997, Ron Davies, by then Secretary of State for Wales, returned the 150,000 pounds and called it a wrong perpetrated by a previous government. In 2007, the Welsh government paid a further £1.5 million to the memorial charity and £500,000 to the education charity. Money 30 and 40 years late. The law moved faster than the money did. In 1969, Parliament passed the Mines and Quarries Tips Act. The first time, tips had to be inspected, recorded, and maintained, and local authorities were given power over disused tips that put the public in danger. It is not much of a memorial, a piece of legislation. 'Tis the reason a hill of waste above a school is now somebody's legal responsibility, with a name on the form, and it is still running. In 2025, the Senate passed the Disused Mine and Quarry Tips Wales Act, creating a Disused Tips Authority for Wales, due to start work in April 2027, and it will be responsible for more than 2,500 disused tips still sitting above Welsh towns and villages. Nearly 60 years on, the country is still going round checking the hills. Pantglas Junior School was never rebuilt. The memorial garden was laid out where the classrooms had been, and the Queen came back in March 1973 to open it. Up in the cemetery, the graves are marked by long rows of white arches. Jeff Edwards, the boy the fireman found by his hair, grew up, became mayor of Merthyr Vale, and spent his life speaking for the people who survived that morning. He met Roy Thomas again, decades later, and the two of them worked out who each other was. In recent years, Jeff Edwards received an obe from King Charles for what he had done for his community. And the letter is still there, in the archive, in a file with a heading somebody typed in 1963. Danger from coal slurry being tipped at the rear of the Pantglas schools. Somebody read that at the time and put it away. If this one stayed with you, subscribe. There are more stories in the vault that should never have been forgotten.